Having spent so long in reorienting our expectations when it comes to studying the origins of coordinated movement, it's time now to actually look at the nervous system, bearing in mind that we are no longer looking at a single locus of control. What we find is we can identify different subsystems within the nervous system, which are involved in different aspects of this whole business of organizing, coordinating, and stabilizing movement. On the brain that you see there, the base is on the left, the front is on the right. You can see the primary motor cortex has been shown in blue. That lies right beside the primary somatosensory cortex that we met before, both of them right here in the middle of the head. The primary motor cortex is the origin of neurons which descend into the spinal cord and ultimately lead to the muscles. So in some sense, this is the part of the brain that's closest to the muscle interface. At the very back of the brain, hanging down low, we have the cerebellum. From an evolutionary point of view, this is much older, and it's like a little mini brain. It has two hemispheres, it has its own kind of neocortex. We don't call it the neocortex, the cerebellar cortex. And it plays this is a different role. We'll have a look at that. And then very deep within the brain are some structures, complex structures, which are, from an evolutionary point of view, very old. We trace those back to the last common ancestor of the human and the frog. We'll call them collectively the basal ganglia. There are many parts involved. So looking first then at the primary motor cortex, I said it's right beside the primary somatosensory cortex. The primary somatosensory cortex is on the right, and you can remember we followed the projections from the skin into the primary somatosensory cortex, and we got this distorted map of the exterior of the body, leading to that homunculus. We see exactly the same thing in primary motor cortex. These two parts of the brain are right beside each other and have almost the same form of organization. We see an exaggerated amount of cortical real estate given over to the mouth and to the hands, and very little to the knees and elbows. The similarity between those two images should strike you as important. They're right beside each other, and in some sense the primary somatosensory cortex that gives rise to that sensory homunculus, that is the closest part of the brain to the receptors in the skin. Likewise, the motor homunculus is the closest part of the brain to the effectors, to the muscles. And yet they're the same guy. Look at them. If you were in a pub and you were talking to one of these and you turned around and saw the other one, you go, hey, I was just talking to you. They are so similar. Now, if you think of the brain purely in input-output terms, that makes no sense. So this should give pause for thought about any interpretation of the brain, at least in its role in coordinated movement, in terms of input and output. So that primary motor cortex is the principal source of nerve impulses to the muscles. The cerebellum plays a rather different role, and we know from many kinds of studies and pathologies, if you damage your cerebellum, you lose stability and the stability of coordination is what's at stake here. The cerebellum serves, as it were, to tighten the coordination. So it's important for posture, for maintaining any position, and for well-learned coordinations, fluent sequences of action. The cerebellum is necessary, and cerebellar damage leads to an inability to sequence coordinations properly. Those deep structures in the brain, the basal ganglia, they have a rather different role, and I like to think of them as being like the conductor of an orchestra. The conductor, remember, doesn't have to know how to play the oboe or how to play the violin, but the conductor sequences them. The conductor tells the oboe and the violin when to come in, how loud, how intense, and what their relation is to other things. And this is a bit like the role of the basal ganglia in sequencing one action after the other, and then fine-tuning them, making sure that they are exquisitely coordinated. So three rather different roles, none of them particularly control-oriented, but all of them lending to this role of the nervous system in bringing about emergent coordination of multiple parts of the body. We've really only talked about locomotion so far, haven't we? And locomotion has this peculiar property that it's roughly periodic, and that's true for jellyfish and bats and fish and you. The coordination problems that arise when we have multiple oscillating elements are in many respects the simplest movement problems that arise. We do all kinds of complex actions that are not simply periodic, that are not just a matter of aligning the phase of oscillators. Speaking is a good example of possibly the most complex form of coordinated action that we do, and there is no simple pulse or regularity or cycle underlying speaking. Speaking poses this demand. You need to sequence a bunch of movements in exactly the right order and with very, very fine coordination between them, but without repetition. Rather, the sequencing is dictated, among other things, by the regularities of the language. Now, did this problem arise for human nervous systems as we acquired language? I don't think that's the case. So we find parallels to this in the animal world, without delving into language. Interestingly, in rodent grooming, we see stereotypical patterns that involve the sequencing of actions, one after the other, in a determinate rule-based sequence. And we find, as we move from one species to the other, we find that the rules that govern the sequencing change from one rodent species to another. So a sequence of grooming moves that's appropriate for this kind of mouse may be built of the same components, but arranged in different order for this kind of guinea pig. Which means that rodent grooming patterns, from a movement perspective, look a lot like human syntax. Isn't that interesting? They look like syntax if we take the view of syntax that it is about the sequencing of individual elements in a coordinated, specific, rule-based sequence. There's a lot more going on in language and speech, but from a movement perspective here, we see once more that the brain is probably not the site of innovation when it comes to language, but language piggybacks on the abilities of the brain, among other things, to sequence fine motor movements. Speech movement control, I said, is highly coordinated. It's extremely complicated. When you speak, there are things going on at different time scales. So on the one hand, you have to speak in coordination with your breathing. You have to breathe in, and speech is, in many respects, the controlled perturbation of the outflowing air. So your respiration is slow every couple of seconds. At the same time, above the larynx, you're moving your tongue, the muscles of your mouth, the face, the lips, the jaw, and the soft palate at the back. And you're doing that to adopt different positions that we associate with different syllables. And you do that about 5 times a second when speaking fluently. So that's a completely different order of timescale. And at the same time, you're controlling the larynx itself, where you have the vocal folds, which are buzzing somewhere between 800 and 300 times a second, between 80 and 300 times a second. So that's much, much, much faster. So this is all going on all at the same time, and these timescales have to interoperate. There's another property of speaking which is odd, which is that normally, as we've noted, the physical environment is extremely relevant and needs to be understood for the role it plays in constraining movement. As I said, you can't walk in water. If I put you in the deep end of the swimming pool, you'll flap your legs, but it won't look like walking movements because the floor is missing. But in speech, we're dealing with movement which is largely isolated from the physical environment. We've got these multiple time scales. And then in speaking, of course, we have the interaction with linguistic constraints. All these movements are there not to grasp the environment, as it were, but to convey symbolic, discrete information at a very high transmission rate. So speech opens us up to the fact that the basic principles of movement are a starting point, but there's an awful lot more to learn as we try to unify these very different perspectives on the body of any animate agent.